All right, you have looked at how you can identify a hair as human or animal. You've done some hair comparisons, so now you've got a sense of what they actually look at when they're doing a hair comparison. Now, recently, and by recently I mean in basically the last 7 years, hair microscopy, which is the comparison method that you did, has come under fire, and that's because there was found to be widespread errors in testimony related to the microscopical hair comparison. To be clear, the analysis was fine, but the problem was in how they were testifying. So let's take a look at how they were testifying.
Defendants in 46 states and Washington, D.C., their convictions involved flawed expert testimony. The FBI now admits that nearly every examiner in an elite forensic unit overstated hair matches. The cases include dozens of death row convictions. Juliana Goldman is in Washington with the research highlighting one of the country's largest forensic science scandals. Juliana, good morning.
Good morning. The study out today by the Innocence Project and the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers shows that hundreds of people were wrongly convicted, all based on FBI agents who gave statements in court that were not based on scientific fact. Cleveland Wright spent 28 years, almost half his life behind bars, serving time for a 1978 murder. His conviction, it now turns out, was based on a false FBI hair analysis.
I didn't know anything about forensics. I didn't know too much about law when I got arrested and locked up. But I just knew I was innocent.
New data shows he is not alone. The Innocence Project and the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers found from the 1970s through 1999, in 268 cases where FBI hair analysis led to a conviction, 257 or 96% of them had errors in analysis.
And I'm going to pause this here because I want you to notice the issue is not in analysis. This is an example where it did not exactly translate across when the journalists got to it, but the issue is that when they testified to far more detail and specificity than what could actually be done. For example, one person was using statistics about how 1 in a million would have this. Someone else was saying that, they've done this for 40-something years and they can for sure pick the single person who gave that hair. So that's the example of flawed testimony that we're looking at.
18 of those defendants were living on death row. 12 had been executed.
Finding a suspect's hair on a victim, or vice versa, finding a victim's hair on a suspect, that's the kind of linkage that prosecutors love.
Larry Kobolinski is a forensics expert. He says microscopic hair analysis was thought of as cutting-edge science, even though there was no way to scientifically identify a match before DNA testing. Still, he says if an FBI agent testifies, juries listen.
There's a certain aura about FBI agents. They are very sharp and very trustworthy. It doesn't mean that their experimentation was done properly.
Wright was exonerated in 2014, but has not been compensated for his 28-year prison term. Still, he remains hopeful for his future and the hundreds of others who may have been wrongfully convicted.
I just thank God for the people that's looking into these cases. Not only mine, other people that's in the same situation that I'm in, they need help too. They're crying out. Their heart is crying out also.
The errors don't mean that there was no evidence of guilt, but defendants may have grounds for appeal. The FBI released a statement yesterday, and in it they say they are committed to ensuring that affected defendants are notified of past errors and will continue to do so until all of the cases are addressed. Charlie?
Now, as it mentioned, there is new technology that allows for DNA testing on hairs. For example, we talked about how if there's tissue on the hair, then we can do what's called nuclear DNA. That's the DNA that can actually link to a single person that you inherit from your mother and your father. So that's this N or nuclear DNA. We'll talk about that more next unit. You can also potentially get mitochondrial DNA from all your hairs, and that is inherited only from your mother. So it's not as specific. It's not to you as an individual, you and your biological siblings who all share a mother would all have the same mitochondrial DNA. But that is something we can do now that we couldn't do, say, back in the 1970s. So with that in mind, knowing that there is this issue with potential flawed testimony, we know the limitations of comparisons, you guys pointed that out, then the question is, why should we continue to allow that microscopical hair comparison? Is there still a good reason to do it, or should we completely get rid of it in favor of only using DNA analysis? So you are going to write a response based on your experience here, so what you actually observed, what you know about the limitations that we see in hairs, and based on what we know about the potential for flawed testimony. I also want you to think about why we might actually want to do microscopical hair comparisons. So you're going to talk about the strengths of doing those microscope comparisons and the limitations. You're also going to talk about the risks of continuing to include those comparison results. Is there a risk if we keep it? And is there any way to make sure that those risks aren't as serious? Then, is there any risk of something bad happening if we say, nope, no more microscopes, only DNA? And is there a way that we can handle those risks? Then I want you to come to a final conclusion. Which way should the field go? Should we still allow there to be microscope hair comparisons, or should we completely check them? So this response is due by next meeting. You have the entire rest of this class time to work, and you're going to turn it in Schoology. There's a special link for it, and you'll see it there. All right, thank you so much, and I will see you next class.